exam was on Thursday, and we're currently grading. We will have your grades posted by the end of the week. I know there was a little bit of an issue where some people logged out and then they had scores. That shouldn't have happened. Ignore it. Obviously, if you saw a number, it doesn't count all the short answer, which was a little bit longer this time than last time. It also doesn't take into account the fact that, you know, we go through the exam and we often give back a point or two given problems with certain multiple choice, right? So don't sweat that. You will have grades posted at the end of the week. In general, the grades so far look better, which is great. I love to see improvement. Not that the first exam was bad, but so that's just something that tends to be pretty typical, I think, in this course. The second exam compared to the first, you know better what to expect in terms of the layout. In general, I also find that students tend to be better thinking about more concrete types of information, and so when we get to the first part is more theoretical in nature, right? We talk more about theories and general perspectives. The second and third exam are richer on specific examples, right? Experiments, phenomena. So I think that ends up working better for people in terms of assessment. Any questions about that before I move on? Okay. For the next couple of classes, I want to talk about what I'll call others, how we think about other individuals, whether, you know, it's a single individual or a group of others. And I'm going to focus on two types of ways of conceptualizing the other. So the first is what we can think of as social groups, right? Most of us belong to one or more social group, and those who are not part of that in-group are, by definition, part of the out-group, right? So we're going to talk about how we think about in-groups versus other groups, both in adulthood and starting off earlier in development. Another way that people make this distinction is they just say us versus them in terms of the groups. And then the developmental question we're going to address here is how children come to form social groups. And when I say they come to form social groups, again, by definition, that means having an in-group versus an out-group. So we'll talk about that distinction. So today I'm going to focus mostly on this idea of social groups. And then when we move on, not this Thursday, but next week, we'll do more in relation to the mental states of others, right? So it could be just one individual, it could be a whole group, but more often than not, it's one other person. And what we're typically talking about here is what people talk about as a theory of mind or mentalizing, right? The idea that I obviously have my own thoughts and beliefs that I have access to at any given time, things that I desire, that I dislike, and so on. But so do other people, right? And so this is the idea that at some point we have to be able to make inferences about what other people might be thinking in terms of their beliefs, their desires, and so on, right? It's even trickier, this ability, because sometimes other people have the same beliefs you do, or have the same desires you do. Usually those are part of your in-group. But other times they have different beliefs and desires. And sometimes one or more of those beliefs may not be based in reality, right? So they could be false beliefs also. So this really sort of complicates how we think about or how, as individuals, we come to think about mental states of others in particular. In philosophy, this kind of distinction has been about, you know, the sort of first pass, which is I have a mental state and I don't know if you do, right? That's weird unless you're talking about a robot, right, or AI. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to sort of have that discussion. When we talk about the developmental states, we're already going to be assuming that the young child knows that you're a person who can have mental states, right? Not a very convincing robot or anything like that. That's something we know from early on in development, right? That even infants are looking at other people's faces and knowing that they're properly humans and that they may have these mental states. Okay. As I said, this is also called theory of mind or mentalizing. Oh, some people also called it mind reading. I don't care which one you use to describe these ideas. They're all treated similarly. And so here we're also going to ask, how do children develop a theory of mind? They will know that other people are people and not robots necessarily. But when do they really figure out that there are mental states in their heads, right? That the thoughts they themselves may be having are thoughts that are possible in someone else's head. Not a trivial thing because you can't see thoughts, right? You can make inferences about thoughts from behavior. You can't actually see them. And initially, those inferences may just be associative, right? They may just reflect the actual behaviors. And young children may not know that there are thoughts driving those behaviors, right? So it's not an easy cognitive process, and so we're going to have to think about what's developing and how. Okay, but let's stick to social groups for a moment. When I talk about social groups, are you all sort of on board with what I'm talking about? Like, what's an example of a social group, maybe that you belong to? What would you consider a social group in your life? Anyone? Yeah.
I think we have social groups sometimes based off of our ethnicity, so like Latinx, I think that's also going to be one.
So people may be part of a social group that consists of other members of their race. Latinx is an example. Yep.
Like sports fan bases.
Sports fans. You may be a Blue Jays fan like me, or maybe not. Am I showing what? It was hard. What? No one was really. I grew up in Toronto, so I was very much. They haven't won since I was a kid, so that was very depressing. Yeah. They haven't. Yeah. It was a very good series.
Yes.
The Dodgers are tough as nails. I'm going to say that.
It's good. It's also schools, like as a family.
Yeah, every alum will become a big part of your life. So those are obviously some examples, and there could be more, right? People belong to sororities or fraternities. That's often considered a social group. People may organize into social groups based on causes or political ideals. Religion is a big part of this also, right? So many examples of different social groups. And good reasons, I think, to have social groups, right? People belong to a sorority, have affiliation with those individuals. They may have common interests. They have friends who they can talk to, right? Common ground, more generally, right? So good reason. You can say that about these other examples, right? Good reason to be part of a religious group or to be part of certain causes. Again, there are shared interests. There are people you can go to for support and so on. That's the idea, right? So that can be very, very useful, and I don't think there's any debating that. I also don't think there's any debating that sometimes being part of a social group, because it necessarily means that there are people who are not part of that group, right, that are the others or the out group, can be problematic, right? So sometimes it's fairly innocuous. So this is the common one, right? There's that rivalry between the Red Sox and the Yankees fans, right? This doesn't seem very nice, but you know, it's all in good fun. And more recently, right, I couldn't help myself, even the little girl was like, little Canadian against the Dodgers, right? So sometimes it's innocuous, right? As being part of an in-group, you have common ground, you have friendship, you have backing, and part of the out-group gets joked about, right, or teased or whatever. It can be fun. I think that's probably obvious. But it can also be much more problematic, right? I think this is the sort of perfect example of Nazi Germany, whereby the out-group, Jews in this case, right, are vilified. They're treated as inhuman. You know, you have a dictator and army that are trying to rid the world of a particular group, right? This is quite extreme. It's known in history. There's also more recent examples, right, of the Ku Klux Klan, who is non-white individuals. So this sort of really spans the full gamut, right, of sort of what we can think about as pros and cons of social groups or social categorization. So on the one hand, the pros, as I've already said, are great insofar as when you're part of a social group, you can often rely on them for support, to enhance your self-worth, and so on. It's also useful insofar as when you can categorize someone as your in-group versus the out-group, your decisions are more efficient, right? It enables you to make specific, very clear, often accurate predictions about what to expect, right? So you as an Emory alum will go on into your later life, you'll meet another Emory alum, and at minimum, you know that there will be some common ground, maybe even some interests, maybe even some similarities with respect to what you think about Atlanta and the institution, right? So you have expectations about what those people are like, and you can make predictions, right, about what they might like or how they might behave. So again, this is what we could think of as the pro side of having these social groups and categorizing people according to us versus them. As I already mentioned, there are also cons. Social groups can create division and separation, right? So, and this is not unlike when we categorize objects, right? So when we categorize objects, remember I talked about how within a particular category, you will have objects that are similar, some may be more prototypical of that category, others less so, but they all belong to that particular group. And objects that are in a different category are distinct and easily dissociable because they belong to that group. So you get more distinction across categories and similarity within by nature of this structure. So what applies to object is also applying to people here. So again, by nature of having the us versus them, the divide between individuals seems to grow larger as a negative consequence here. And then there are the very unfortunate cases, as I said, of Nazi Germany and like the Ku Klux Klan, who vilify members of the out-group. At minimum, it creates some dislike, right? So I guess I don't really love Dodgers fans. At least if I'm watching the game in the Sky Dome in Toronto, right, or Rogers Center, whatever it's called now, right? At least in those cases, there's a little bit of tension, but it can be much more extreme than that, of course. Okay, and these are the kinds of things that we see in adults that are characteristic of adults' social groups and how we categorize social groups. But we'll see primitives of this, right? Precursors of this in young children's social categories also. Okay. So I already asked you, what kind of groups you may be a part of, and aligned with that, you can sort of lay out more specifically what features are the things that are likely to lead to social group categorization. So one well-studied feature of social groups is that we often separate out based on interest. Makes sense, because those are the people you're more likely to be friendly with, to be able to talk to, and so on. So it makes a lot of sense that you would do it based on just sheer interest, right? Now, this is something that's going to emerge over development because young kids have to figure out what they're interested in. But by adulthood, interest is a very big way in which we form social groups. So for example, we already mentioned sports, there's politics, there's religion, there might be the type of eater you are, right? Vegetarian versus not. There are lots of ways to do this based on interest. Okay. We previously also talked about doing it on the basis of race. This is not interest. This is more what we would say is familiarity. So given that young children are already going to be showing familiarity effects that we've seen on preferential looking, you can anticipate and predict that this kind of social group categorization is the thing you might see earlier in development than the one based on interest, for example, right? Okay, so familiarity, people will divide up into us and them based on race. People who look like them, and by default, maybe you expect them to have similar interests and like similar things, but at minimum, they look like you. Yeah.
I was just gonna ask, like, why is religion under interest and not?
It could be under familiarity, particularly if you become sort of immersed into it early in development. But assuming you don't and you've come to it later in life based on,
So it like could be both.
it could be both, right? I'm doing this actually more based on the adult version of it, but you're right. If it starts early, it can be a type of familiar group. But there's race, there's language. Language is an obvious one, in part because the consequence is that you can't even talk to someone who speaks a different language, so how would you interact? Hence no proper in-group. Gender is also a big one. You see this early in development. This is probably one of the earlier ones in development. Kids really show in-group favoritism based on their gender, right? Girls are good, boys are bad, and vice versa. That's a very common one to see early in development. Okay. So these are typically what you see out in the world in terms of how we categorize ourselves in terms of social groups. But to show you and to convince you that this actually can be quite quick and actually quite superficial, right? So on the one hand, you know, being in the same social group as someone who speaks the same language is quite deep, right? Because you wouldn't be able to talk to them even if you didn't share the same language. Religion, right? Whether it's familiarity or interest, it's quite deep because it says something also about your beliefs and interests. But there are other very superficial ways, right? Something like a sports team may be somewhat superficial, although not for everybody, I grant that. But you could do something even more superficial, right? So there are these classic demonstrations of what scholars call minimal groups, right? So the experiment goes something like a bunch of you come into the lab to do an experiment. You're being told that for this experiment, you're all going to do it at the same time. And then, you know, I don't know, they give you some cover story, but regardless, some of you wear red shirts and some of you wear blue shirts, right? You do some tasks for a little bit, and then it doesn't have to be very long. And it's just about wearing a different colored shirt. And then you get asked about how much you like those people, whether you think they share similar interests and so on. And it matters, right? This little thing that makes you superficially similar to someone else in the moment is a way that affects your perceptions of that person, right? Another example of this was they brought people into the lab. This one was actually done with people one at a time. And they had to do this unrelated task of estimating the number of dots on a screen, right? When we get to the numbered lecture, you'll see a lot more examples of estimating the number of dots on a screen. But this is what people did. They came into the lab, they were told to estimate the number of dots. So dots flash up on the screen, and you just type in your answer, 20, 30, 5, and so on, right? And then afterwards, the experimenter tells you, okay, thank you for participating, but you should know you're an underestimator, right? Whenever you see dots, you underestimate the number. I mean, who cares if you're an underestimator? It's not a meaningful thing. And other people are told, okay, thank you for doing this, you're an overestimator, right? Again, how superficial and unimportant is it to know that you're either an underestimator or overestimator? Well, in this minimal group context, it matters. Later on, if you're brought back into the lab and you're introduced to other underestimators and you're an underestimator versus, right, you sort of break out into groups based on this meaningless thing you were told, right, about being an underestimator versus an overestimator. So that's what we mean by sort of these minimal groups and the idea that group membership can be fast. It can be pretty superficial and arbitrary, right? But it matters. It affects how we interact with other people. So, I mean, it can be a little scary, but that's what it is. So yes, when you're told about underestimator versus overestimator, you like the underestimators better, for example. Okay. Any questions about all of this? Okay, so what happens with kids? And how do they begin to create these sort of social groups? And how do these social groups begin to impact their lives? So, to be able to have a social group and recognize the distinction between us versus them, it necessarily means that you need to know something about us and who you are, right? And so to see what babies know about themselves, one very cool experiment done several years ago now, actually by a member of this department, Philippe Rochat, he did this many years ago with his graduate students. He wanted to ask, is there an emerging sense of self? Because again, if you don't have a sense of self, then there's no distinction to be made between self and other, right? You're basically all the same. So at minimum, we need to see when this aspect, this feature of life begins to develop. Okay. So here's the experiment that he did that I think is super cool. It was many years ago, so you had this massive TV in front of the kid, right, instead of just angled over. And this is actually really how it was set up. It just had like these ropes holding it. I don't know why any parent agreed to have their kid participate in this, right? Especially if you don't believe Rochat, you're probably like, does he really know how to like put this together? Right? So you have the TV up in front of the baby, okay? And the baby comes into the lab, he's put on this little bed, and the other thing that happens is he's given these striped socks that are very bright. The kid sees them, presumably now recognizes that I'm wearing these socks that I wasn't before, right? Okay. These are very young babies, they're only 3 months. And then what happens is, this is just a video of the baby looking at the screen. But what's important is when the baby looks at the screen, right? So sometimes the screen is actually showing them is a video of their own legs. So their own legs just moving around, okay? So it's like looking in the mirror. Other times that video is delayed by some amount. So what you're moving is not, how you're moving is not what you're seeing, okay? So the question is, how much do babies know about themselves in relation to their body even from this very early age, right? So it turns out that by 3 months of age, they already look longer at the one that is incongruent, right? They're surprised by the fact that their legs are not matching up. Again, this is not trivial because the only way you would know that your legs are matching up is if you have a good sense of how your body is moving and what it should look like. So Philippe Rachat talks about this as, oh, this is incorrect. I said it was longer congruent. I'll fix that. It should say incongruent. But I'll fix that before I post it. So it basically shows an awareness of their bodily movement. That's critical because the idea is that who you are and your sense of who you are as a person and the stuff that falls out of that, like what your race is, what your gender is, what your age is, sort of develops from this very primitive sense of just what your body feels like, right? And so importantly, if that's the case, you would want to see this sense early in development, and you do. By 3 months, you already see that there's this understanding of how your body moves in the world and what it should look like from afar, right? And maybe even to others. Okay? Yeah.
What age were these babies?
3 months.
Oh,
Yeah, so
I
pretty,
didn't see.
yeah, pretty young, again, to do this. Particularly given that, you know, they're not, they will have seen mirrors, I'm sure, but they're not usually being put in front of the mirror to see how they're behaving and learning that alignment. If they have, again, this would be happening very quickly over development, but it's crucial. You want this kind of foundation about knowing your body to learn more about yourself and then how you can be distinguished from other people. Yeah.
So in this case, they're looking longer at the footage, right? 'Cause at first I thought, oh, they're looking at their legs.
No. They can look at their legs, and so you could just say, are they kind of matching it, for example? But it would be hard to do if you're looking up and down to like match it exactly. If I were doing this though, now, and I'm sure Dr. Rachat would feel the same way, it would probably be better to cover their legs, right? Let them see that they're wearing the socks, then maybe cover it and make sure it's really about your feeling of your body and what you're looking at, for sure. Otherwise, it's just matching, right? It's just perceptual matching, agreed. So again, I'll fix this. They actually ended up looking longer at the incongruent, but again, in this case, it's a pattern that doesn't really matter, right? Because if they look longer, regardless of which one they look longer at, it shows they discriminate them, right? And they treat them differently. And that's critical because if they weren't aligning it with their bodies, then the videos would just be the same. They'd be there'd be no meaningful distinction because it's legs with the socks. Okay. Okay. So the other thing you see really early in development is that there is the preference for the familiar, right? The preference for the familiar, though, doesn't necessarily mean by itself that you've distinguished between your in-group and your out-group. Okay, I'll show you what I mean more by this. It shows that you do discriminate, that these people are different. It's based on familiarity, so it's likely the familiarity means that you're treating yourself as the other, but not definitely, right? Maybe it's just exposure. So we'll want to do a more direct test of what it means to be part of the in-group. Okay, so this is what was done in these experiments. So this is based on language. So babies come into the lab, and now they see two women. One woman speaks in English, the other one speaks in French. And they get to see each woman, right, speaking English versus French. And then at minimum, you can do what we've done before with babies, you can do preferential looking, right? You can say, okay, the baby now knows that one speaks English, the one speaks French. Who do they look at longer? Not surprisingly, as you saw even with silent clips, right? They look longer at the one that speaks their own language. So if you're an English baby, or if you're a baby living in an English-speaking environment, they're not fully speaking yet. These are usually younger babies, maybe about 10 months. You look longer at the English speaker. If you're growing up in a French-speaking environment, you look longer at the French speaker. This is not surprising because, again, even if these were silent videos, we've already seen that babies will already have a preference for their own language. They're so familiar with it, they don't even need the audio. They can just do it based on the mouth movements. Any questions about this? Yeah.
How old are the babies in this?
These are about 10 months. Okay, so here's the critical part that I really love about this experiment in terms of trying to get at whether it's a more meaningful distinction between in-group and out-group, and not just familiarity based on language. So after they see the English speaker versus the French speaker, instead of just doing looking time, they actually have the women both hold out a toy. It's the exact same toy. It's like this green frog, this green stuffed frog. They both hold out the toy. They're showing this on the video, and then they rate the experiment because it's on video, where the experimenter then brings these toys out from under the table, right? So it looks like the toy is coming out from the video to a baby, not us, right? So it comes out, and then babies are given a choice. This is the exact same toy. It's a green stuffed toy. There is no reason to prefer one green frog over the other. They're exactly the same. So if the language the person was speaking was meaningless, you'd pick at chance, right? You'd pick equally. That's not what babies do. Babies who are growing up in the English-speaking environment take the toy from the English speaker, and the ones growing up in the French-speaking environment take the toy from the French speaker. This suggests that not only is there a difference, right, there's a preference based on familiarity, but now you may have these social categories that are supporting how you decide to interact with people, right? And the idea here is that this is maybe sort of an early example of you trying to associate more with the in-group than the out-group, because you take the toy, even though it's exactly the same toy, from the one who speaks your language. And when they're taking the toy from the baby, the people aren't speaking anymore, right? Now they're completely silent. So it's not like they're doing it because they're also trying to engage with that person in terms of the language. Okay, so these are what the data look like. These are the number of trials, and the statistical difference is that the French babies in the French-speaking environment, these are the 10-month-old choices, are more likely to take the toy from this woman, and the babies in the English-speaking environment take the toy from this woman. Okay, and all the other things you care about have been controlled, like they're rated the same in terms of attractiveness and whatnot, right? But again, maybe that doesn't totally matter because you get this difference between French and English-speaking babies. Okay, so does that make sense? Okay, so that's an early demonstration of that by 10 months of age, babies they seem to be dividing up the world in terms of the language you speak, and now they're deciding they would rather interact with the person who is from the group that speaks their language, even if they themselves are not speaking yet, and the person in the moment is not speaking with them yet. Okay. So here's another task. The results are already up here, but this is even more direct in terms of the implications that the social groups have. So these are 5-year-old kids. They come into the lab and they are shown on a computer screen 2 kids. One kid speaks in English. There are many different kinds of animals at the zoo. Another kid speaks in French, says the same thing but in French. And then you ask these kids who are American and speak English, who do you want to be friends with, right? The kids look fairly similar across trials, right? They're all equally cute, right? You would match on the basis of gender. You have to match on the basis of gender because if you manipulate gender, kids pick their own gender first and foremost, right? So when they don't have gender to pick from, right, if they're both boys or both girls, by and large, kids want to be friends with the other kid who speaks their language. So some people say, okay, that's interesting, but is this really, yeah, maybe you're going to ask. Go ahead.
Wouldn't they just be like no understanding that?
Yeah, that's exactly what people say, right? So is this really about your social group and the implications that come from that, or is it the fact that if you're gonna have a friend, you need to be able to talk to them, right? So it doesn't make sense. Any thoughts on how you might address this? Especially if you live in the US. Any thoughts? Yeah.
You might have both of them speak gibberish, but both like the gibberish things like match different languages. Does that make
How?
sense?
Yeah, how? Tell me.
Like I guess like the syntax for English versus the syntax of French is very different. So you would.
Yeah, so you could get ones that are more different, but yes, that's a great idea. They didn't do that, but they did something similar. They did something which actually leverages, again, what really happens in the US, which is that there are people with different accents, right? So what you can do is you can take someone saying the exact same English sentence, and maybe it also, the challenge with your suggestion, which is great, but what if kids were like, I don't want to pick because I can't talk to either of them, right? Which would be more along the concerns of this. But now you have a kid that says this sentence that you understand, but one kid says it with a northern accent and another kid says it with like a southern accent. Well, you get the same effects, right? So this would be, for example, this shouldn't say French and English, but this would be like, these were kids with a northern accent, tested in the Northeast, for example, and they would pick the kid that speaks with the Northeast accent, not the kid that speaks with the Southern accent, right? So now it can't just be unintelligible, right? It's about similarity in the way the language is being produced. Okay, yeah.
Are they hearing the kid say it out loud, or are they reading the English version?
They see it. They see the words on the screen, but then they also hear it.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? So I think this again is very meaningful because with the accent, you can understand either kid, right? You, in principle, could be friends with either kid. Of course you can, right? And you don't know anything else about their interests or religion, and race doesn't matter in this case because it's held constant, right? Gender doesn't matter. So why in the world would you care that someone has a different accent? But it turns out that by 5, maybe earlier, you do, right? That determines who you're going to associate with. And it may seem pretty innocuous at first, it probably is, right? It's just like maybe whose team you want to join, who you're going to be friends with for that day. But this is the kind of thing that can snowball, right? That can create more and more division, more closeness within the group, but more division across the groups. Okay. So this is language. What about race? So again, we know that like with language, there are early differences based on preferential looking experiments we've seen, where kids of different races prefer to look at faces that align with their race and the race that they're, the community that surrounds them, right? So white babies looking longer at images of white adults and black babies looking longer at images of black adults, right? Okay, but again, the preferential looking could just be familiarity in this very superficial sense. Does it mean that you will categorize the world based on your race versus someone else's? And will it determine who you want to associate with, including who you want to be friends with, right? So we can do the exact same experiments they did with the language with kids, right? So here's the first demonstration that they've done, where now you have 2 women. This time they speak the same language, and let's say they're being tested in the US, so they're both speaking English. They were being tested in France, they would be both speaking in French, but what matters is that one is white, the other one is black. Same procedure, they show the 2 exact toys. The toys go down and then it comes up from under the table and the kid is asked to pick one. Does the kid pick based on race? So we know that they look longer based on race. Do they look longer do they pick now based on race? No. Okay, so these are not significantly different. The error bars are overlapping at 10 months, and these are white babies. So at 10 months, Whereas they take the toy from the person who speaks their language, they do not take the toy from the person who's their race. They take equally. So this again shows that you really do want to assess more than just preferential looking. Because these are kids at this age who are, if they're American and white, they are looking longer at the white woman. But they don't care who they take the toy from, right? So it suggests that at least race, in comparison to the language, is maybe a less strong social marker for babies, for children. Okay, so if it's not a social marker at 10 months, the way that language was, when does it emerge? Because we know that people are going to make distinctions based on race, right, and their social groups. So when does it emerge? So it turns out, I'll just skip to the end for the moment, it turns out it doesn't emerge before the age of 5. So at 5, if you do that other experiment where you had the 2 kids telling you that, you know, they like the zoo or they're going to the zoo, this time instead of a different language, one is white, one is black, the kids will pick based on their own race. Here I'm only showing you the data for the white kids who pick the white individual, not the black individual, but you can get the flip with the black kids. And I'm saying it's not before age 5 because we know it wasn't there at 10 months. And in a task with 2.5-year-olds, they asked kids who they wanted to share their toys with, right? And they would be given the choice between, if they're white kids, between a white kid and a black kid, and they shared their toys equally, right? So it doesn't seem that, at least for race, even though babies are sensitive to race, right? It's not like they don't discriminate based on race, and in fact, they prefer to look longer at the race that is familiar to them. It doesn't seem that race gets used as a social category until 5, which is probably a very good thing, right? In a way, right? Better, you think that it's better to be later than earlier for this sort of thing, given the social ramifications. But in any case, not all of these social markers, so to speak, are developing on the same timeline. The language is a much more important cue than race. Yeah.
So they changed the task for like different year-old children, like different ages?
Yeah, the reason is that with 2.5-year-olds, so gender, for example, gender is more like language. It emerges earlier than race for social categories, right? If you ask a 5-year-old, to pick between a boy and a girl, and if they're a girl, they almost always pick the girl, and vice versa for the boys. At 2.5, they don't do that consistently, but if you ask who they want to share their toys with, they do. So we know that at least at 2.5, when it comes to sharing toys, that you can pick out social categories, another type of social category. So what they're doing here with race is trying to use tasks that have been shown reliably with other indices of social group, right? So we know that this has been shown reliably for language with 10-month-olds, not for race. Now we know that this task of sharing is used reliably for gender, not, right? Because like you, as you're astutely pointing out, is that maybe it's just the nature of the task, right? Maybe if you had asked them who they want to be friends with, they pick based on race. They do for gender, but not race. Any other questions? Okay, yeah.
So have they tried like I'm just wondering if it has to do with like the task, like you said, like have they tried the sharing task for like 5-year-olds, for example?
If you do the sharing task with 5-year-olds, they also pick the kid of their race. So now they're across the board, yeah. The reason they're using the sharing task at 2.5 is it seems to be more sensitive, at least for other indices like gender. Okay, so the race versus language thing is quite intriguing. Given that, I don't know, people would have predicted maybe the opposite or at least the same timeline. Because again, based on the looking times, these are distinct markers, right, in terms of familiarity preferences. But again, maybe not distinct markers of social group. So here's a task, a study that I find just crazy. So this is work with older kids. This is not infants anymore. This is starting at around 5 or so again. And what Katie Kinsler at the University of Chicago and her former grad student were trying to do was, again, trying to understand this language and race distinction in terms of markers of social groups. So they developed this task where you could basically pit language and race against each other in a really cool way. Okay, so the kids come into the lab. They're shown this kid on a computer screen. In this example, the kid is white, and he speaks English. There are 7 colors in the rainbow. He could be saying different things, right? White kid speaking English. Now, the kid is forced this point. When asked, who does this child become? Say this guy. It's amazing, right? Okay. Now, when I first saw this, it was at a conference. Kind of blew my mind, right? How can this be? But I'm very familiar with these authors. I went to the University of Chicago. I was a graduate student there. I didn't overlap. Katie Kinsler was not a professor there yet, so we didn't overlap. But I know about the University of Chicago and the culture. So let me tell you a bit about that. So for my dissertation, I tested a lot of kids in the University of Chicago lab school. You know, a lot of these universities have lab schools where the professors send their kids. So I would go and I would test a lot of these kids for my dissertation. And this is anecdotal, but it really, I think, makes my point. So I was testing a 3-year-old on a computer task. It was a spatial game. We'll get to spatial stuff later. So I was testing the kid on this spatial game. And during the experiment, the little girl turns to me and she says, okay, but I just want to know, am I in the experimental group or the control group? Right? I mean, 3-year-olds don't normally know what experimental versus control is, right? And I said, oh, well, I can't tell you now, but wait until the end. Like, let's finish my game, and at the end I'll tell you, right? Because I just needed to get her through the game. And I forgot. I forgot to tell her at the end. So as I'm walking her back to the classroom, she says, wait a minute, you never told me. Was I in the experimental or the control group? And so I said to her, well, actually, this is a within subjects design. So that means that you're the experimental and the control. And she was like, okay, no 3-year-olds that we know would be excited about it within stuff, right? So I'm saying all of this to say that University of Chicago kids are not normal. They're weirdos. So you could legitimately ask, which I think I did at this conference, where I was like, are these kids just weird, right? And not the weird in the Western European, right? Weird as in properly live an isolated existence, right? So they took this really seriously. They were thinking it too. And so they ended up testing kids, also white, but not University of Chicago. These were kids in Wisconsin. I don't remember what the town was. But these are not little weirdo University of Chicago professors' kids, right? These are normal children, and they still show this effect. So it's consistent that among white kids, European American, that they can distinguish race, obviously. They can tell the difference between black and white individuals. They're not, right, colorblind, like people would say. They can distinguish the difference. They pick more consistently one over the other, and we know they can do this in infancy, but they don't understand what race means to an individual or a group, right? They don't understand that it's stable, which you would think would be so obvious, right? They don't understand that there's continuity in this way, right? So what's interesting is that they also ended up then, these are all European American, these are all white kids. They ended up testing African American kids on the south side of Chicago, not University of Chicago kids, but geographically, University of Chicago is on the south side, geographically similar. And what they find with the African American kids is that they actually know the right answer, right? So this is really interesting because it shows, in addition to the delays that kids have in terms of incorporating race into their social categories, it also, the interpretation of this is that it matters what you know about race and the environment you're in, right? So the idea here is that whereas these white kids are not at home talking to their parents about race and what it means and how it matters, the younger African American kids are, and as a consequence, they know more about what race means for the social world, right, and how it gets used in social categories. So there's obviously very important experiential effects here with respect to this kind of social categorization. Okay. Any questions about all of this? Okay. Jeff.
They, for the child that they showed, for what he was growing up into, they showed like a white child. Did they do it with the African American child as well?
Oh, if the younger kid, yeah, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
It's they do it across several trials, and they counterbalance all of that. So sometimes the kid is white, sometimes the kid is black, sometimes he's speaking English, sometimes he's speaking. So all the permutations show up. Doesn't matter. Again, the weird thing is the white kids think your race can transform in some weird way. Yeah.
Do they only stick with like English and French and white and black, or do they expand beyond that?
They've only done, in this experiment it was only white and black and English and French. I don't know if they tried with other races and how strong the effect is, or if it replicates with other races. I suspect other languages it won't matter, but with other races it might. Maybe because if this depends on experience, then it may depend on how much experience you have with other races, and again, whether families are more likely to talk about certain races than others. Who knows, right? But it's possible that it would differ. Yeah.
Did they study older African American kids to see if the difference got bigger? Like the 9 to 10 versus 5 to 6?
Yeah, it does. It just gets more accurate, right? Because again, there is a right answer here. This has to be true, right? So yeah, so it just gets more accurate. Not just, it gets more accurate. Yeah, okay. Okay, so sort of going back to the idea that, you know, unless you're talking about Nazi Germany or the Ku Klux Klan, this stuff doesn't really matter, right? Maybe, yeah, you start off by showing these familiarity preferences and, you know, you're more likely to take toys from certain individuals or be friends with certain individuals, but who cares, right? Because maybe it just means that you're forming these in-groups, you have people with similar interests who support you, it's good for your self-worth, but you don't necessarily do harm to the other, right? I haven't shown you that they're doing harm or they think negatively of the other, just that, you know, they take toys, want to be friends, have expectations about continuity with respect to these things of language and race. And if that's it, right, if it's about categorizing and maybe even leveraging the support you get from your in-group without doing harm to the out-group, then it might be fine, right? No negative consequences for the world. Is that possible? Okay, so let's build to that, and I'll continue next time with this also. So ways of trying to get at whether it's not just that you prefer the in-group, but that you might also, or you like the in-group, you might also dislike the out-group. This has been done in different ways, using different tasks. So in adults, if you ask people, right, let's say you're a big, let's say you're a big time, like, more socialist type Democrat, and you ask them whether you dislike people who are more pro-Trump and stuff. I was gonna say maybe they say no and they really do, but they're probably honest about it, right? But, you know, with something like like race, maybe you wouldn't, right? Even if you're biased against or racist against another individual, if someone actually asks you, do you dislike other white people or other African American people or Asian, you're probably not going to say yes, even if you do, right? So at least in adults, they've tried to get at this more implicitly to see whether there are these negative associations with the outgroup. It's done in a very classic, famous way. It's come to be known as the IAT measure. It stands for the Implicit Association Test. Some people call it the Implicit Attitudes Test. It's still IAT. And what's critical about this task is that you don't ask people, again, explicitly, whether they dislike or like people of other races or groups, but you try to measure it implicitly, looking at their reaction times and the errors that they make when doing this task. So what's the task? The task is that there's always two types of trials, and one type of trials you may call the congruent ones, based on a stereotype, and the other the incongruent ones. Okay, so let's say that there's a stereotype in the world, you know, that white people are superior, they're better than African Americans, right? It's sadly probably a stereotype that really does exist, right? Now, the question is, do people know this stereotype? Do they endorse it? So the way they do this is they bring people into the lab, they show them faces of white people or black people, and they say, whenever you see white, press the left key. Whenever you see the black person, press the right key. But then they're also told that you're going to see words, right? And some of the words are like positively valence, like good, better, smarter, and that sort of thing. And the other words are negatively valence, like bad words. So again, if it's a white person, hit this key. If it's a black person, hit this key. And then on what I'm calling the let's say these are the congruent trials on the right based on the stereotype. In the congruent trials, they'll be told that when you see bad words, press, what did I say? I said white on the left? Yeah. If you see good words, press the left also, so that white and good are matching up. And when you see bad words, press the right key so that black and bad are matching up, right? So these are called the congruent trials based on the stereotype that we think exists in the world, right? And that we're trying to see whether people have. So you measure their reaction times during the congruent trials, and you also measure their reaction times during the incongruent trials. Now, the incongruent trials are where the valence words are mismatched with the stereotype, right? Meaning that this time you're told, if it's a white person and you see bad words, press left. If it's a black person and you see good words, press right. Does that make sense? Okay, so there are congruent trials and incongruent trials, and the idea is if you endorse this stereotype that black is bad, then when they match up, you'll be faster because it makes sense. They go together. If you don't, and if you do also, you should be slower at these because there's a mismatch, right? So the idea is that if you endorse this stereotype that you're measuring, then you'll be faster on congruent than incongruent. So you're comparing you're comparing reaction times between congruent and incongruent. Make sense? And you can do this for any stereotype you might be interested in, right? And there's actually a free resource. It's called Project Implicit. They have thousands of data where you can log on, do these different tasks. You could say, okay, do I want to do one based on race? Do I want to do one based on religion? Do I want to do one based on sexual orientation, age, whatnot, right? You'll be presented with these trials, and you can get your scores. And what you typically find is that there is a faster response when the trials are congruent compared to when they're incongruent, right? So this is the bias effect that you pick up on the IAT. Now, these are data that you can pick up from Project Implicit that include participants. Typically, these are young adults, but they can be older. They're not kids, but they're adults, and they come from all races. Why does that matter? because what it means is that the bias, if this is picking up on a stereotype, that bad is black and white is good, then it means that both white and black people endorse the stereotype, right? So that's the idea, because for the most part, people show these effects, right? So now the question becomes, and it has for a lot of scientists, is this really picking up on endorsement of a stereotype, or is this something else? Yeah.
And this was in accordance with the participants' races, or no?
Well, it doesn't matter what the
Oh,
participant
because
race
the
is,
stereotype is the same.
because they show the same effect.
Okay.
So if you're a white person doing this, you show the effect. If you're a black person doing this, you show the effect.
Even if it's like, so in this case, like the white person was associated with the good stereotype.
That's right.
Even black person.
That's right. So then you can ask, and people have asked, is this really measuring endorsement of stereotypes, right? How could it be, right? It's very likely that if you're a black person, you're not going around being racist against other black people, right? It seems very unlikely. So the pushback has been with this test, and what people now believe, and what has been shown, is that whereas this shows knowledge of what could be a stereotype out there in the world, it doesn't show endorsement necessarily, right? It could, right? It could be that obviously there are going to be people who do this who are racist against other individuals, but these data alone cannot tell you whether someone is going to go out there in the world and be racist. It can't. What it does tell you is that there's a very pervasive stereotype that people know, right? I will show this effect if, for example, I'm doing a task where you're lining up gender and, let's say, intelligence or STEM capacities. Trust me, I don't hold men and women to a different standard when it comes to a math test or a science test. I can tell you for sure that I do not, right? And yet I'll still show that effect. But again, it's probably because when you're doing this implicit task and when you're doing this implicit task and you have knowledge of those associations, that drives your reaction times, right? I was mortified when I went on Project Implicit, like other people I know, and some of these effects show up. Trust me, try it. You will be flipped. You'll be very disappointed. I was especially disappointed once because I did one based on sexual orientation, and it looked like I was endorsing this stereotype of homosexuality being bad and heterosexuality being good. And I remember saying to my friends, this can't be true. Because if anything, I like gay people more than I like straight people, right? I was like, this can't be true. But anyway, so it's now well known that this can tell you something about when you have knowledge of particular stereotypes, not necessarily endorsement, right? Okay.
If they know what, I feel like it's pretty easy to figure out what the activity's about, or I don't know if they're told what the activity's about, but do you think they purposefully
show the effect?
No, purposefully don't, because they don't want to see
so
racist.
if anything, you could make the argument that these effects, which show that people have these stereotypes, right, are not being overridden. Because you think you want to, right? You don't, if you really endorse these stereotypes, you don't want to show that you do, right? Especially in this lab setting with, psychologists and these experimenters. You don't want to show it. And this shows you that you can't really override it, right? Because you get the effects. If you didn't get the effects, you could say, well, maybe people are just pretending or they're trying to override it. It is actually hard to fake reaction time data that's within a second. Errors you could probably fake, right? But again, what's happening here in terms of the mistakes they make. So this is when you shoot at a black person when they're not holding a gun, right? So you're more likely to shoot the black guy who's unarmed, holding a phone, and you're less likely when the white guy is armed, right? So that's those data you could probably fake. The reaction times are harder, but in any case, the faking would usually be so that you don't seem biased. Right. And if people are showing the bias, it's probably not, right? Okay, these are adults. Any questions about this? Other questions? Okay, so there have been some of these not the shooter one, but the IET versions of it with younger kids that show similar effects, that by 5 and 6 years of age, kids are at least aware of the stereotypes, and so it's coming out in their implicit responses. Here's a more explicit one that is interesting, and I don't know. It's hard to know what it really means, but on the face of it, it doesn't seem ideal, right? So this is some classic work with young children, particularly girls, because they're being asked here which doll they would want to play with. And then they're just given examples of the exact same doll, but it varies in skin color. And this bias has decreased significantly in recent generations. It's still there, but it has, I think, nicely and fortunately, it has decreased. But when it was originally done, this work in the late 70s and early 80s, you very consistently saw that black girls were picking the whiter doll, right? This is the idea that they're placing greater value on the majority race, right? Why are they placing greater value in that cult? Well, obviously in these cultures, the majority race is being associated with better things, right? Resources, access to different, who knows, right? But regardless, this is something that sadly, right, is being picked up on young kids, that a minority kid is thinking the majority kids and people are better, right? Like I said, this effect has declined significantly in recent generations, which I think is great. But the fact that, it exists in the face of all the other in-group favoritism that we see relative to gender language, the fact that the babies will look longer at the race that they're familiar with, and yet, when they get to be about 5 years of age, right, they were selecting based on the majority race and what the positive connotations are with that particular type of individual versus their own minority. Okay, so these are just some examples of how you can test these effects explicitly, more implicitly, and we'll continue on next time with babies and asking how they feel about the out-group member, okay? See you next time.